Welcome to this Q&A lesson on rest stroke and free stroke for the classical guitar. First, I would like to thank all of my Patreon followers for submitting the questions for today and for offering all their support. And if anyone else really values the site or these videos, feel free to check out my support page or my Patreon. But of course, you can just follow the lessons for free. So today's lesson, we're not going to be giving a lesson on rest stroke and free stroke, but I'll be answering people's questions. So make sure you go to the website and check out my right hand position articles and other lessons on rest stroke and free stroke if you're more on the beginner side. Once you've done that, hopefully today's questions will answer some of the questions that come up in daily practice. Before I dive in and answer all the questions, I just wanted to mention that I really highly recommend that you practice rest stroke and free stroke in your technique sessions. Make sure that that technique is available to you if you choose to use it. So there's a lot of debate as to when to use rest stroke, when to use free stroke, whether one technique is good for certain musical textures or not. And there's a lot of debate. So before I even say anything about that, because there's no definitive answers necessarily, but before I say anything, you want to practice it so it's available to you to use and experiment in your pieces. And there's many benefits to practicing both in terms of practicing your pieces and or performing your pieces, which are sometimes different things. Sometimes I will practice rest strokes but use free stroke in performance, and I'll talk more about that later. But let's dive into the questions now, but just keeping that in mind that we always want to have all of our technique in order so that it's available to us to experiment with to get the best results that we would like to get. So the first question, I've kind of combined questions by Brian, David, Stefano, Dieter, and Jonathan all into one question. So sorry if I'm not addressing your individual questions, but all five of you had a very similar question. So I think I'll try to address it in one go here. So essentially the question was, do we change the angle of attack or hand position when switching between rest stroke and free stroke? And is it the same type of finger stroke? So the first thing I'll say is from a teacher's perspective, and the way that I personally teach is that no, I keep the same hand position for free stroke or rest stroke. So same hand position, whether I'm doing free strokes like this or rest strokes like this. So as a teacher, that's what I always teach, is it's the same hand position. In performance, you will sometimes see people change their hand positions. Less so in the modern professional circuit, but there's still times when people will change their hand position and go back a little bit for rest stroke and go forward a bit for free stroke. But the reason I would say that to not change your hand position is because sometimes we'll mix rest strokes and free strokes in close proximity. Maybe it would be in a scale where you're going like rest, free, rest, free. If you're combining them in close proximity, it would be really awkward to be changing your hand position every time you do a rest stroke. It'd be a lot of like this going on in the right hand, like changing of hand positions off and on very rapidly. So because we sometimes use rest stroke and free stroke in close proximity, I would say that's one danger of changing your hand position. The other thing is that I don't think of rest stroke and free strokes as very different. One real strong goal you might have is to make your free strokes very similar to your rest strokes. When you do a rest stroke, if you're pushing in towards your stomach, you're pushing the string into the guitar to get lots of volume out of it. It's easy because you can really push in without worrying about sounding the string below, by accident, like that. So the thing is though, when you do free stroke, you want to push in as well, but you just have like a little bit of a steeper follow through, so you bypass the string below. And as long as your knuckles are up high enough, you can do both rest stroke or free stroke. And if you push in push that string in a similar way, you will achieve a very similar sound out of both your rest strokes and free strokes. I think that for students, especially beginners and early intermediate students, their rest strokes tend to sound very loud and their free stroke very soft. And that's just because they haven't really balanced out the stroke and made it similar. Of course, if we're pushing in a lot with our free stroke, there's a subtlety to not hitting the string. You know, your technique has to be in order, your hand position has to be in order, and your finger movement, you have to have come to that realization that the stroke is very similar. There's just like a millimeter difference with the follow through. So yes, to answer the question, I try not to change the angle of my hand or the finger position or the angle of attack, regardless if it's rest stroke or free stroke. In reality, yes, sometimes you will see some change, even in my hands and in some professionals as well. But I think from a teaching perspective, I'd really like to say, try to keep the same hand position and maintain it so that you can practice scales by going, rest, free, 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 rest, free, 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 rest, free, 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 rest, free, free. You can practice rest stroke and free stroke in close proximity. And when you're practicing, if you're using it, sometimes we'll use a rest stroke in the practice session to mark a melodic note we want to bring out. And I'll do it in the practice session. But because I don't want to mute the second string all the time, in performance I'll do free stroke. But the muscle memory of doing a deep rest stroke with that finger, as soon as I switch to free stroke, my finger kind of remembers to put a little bit of extra weight into that stroke. And so I'll sometimes use rest strokes in the practice room to secure a muscle memory into a finger, and then use free stroke in performance, and the free stroke will just be a little bit deeper. So it's kind of like it's partly muscle memory, partly psychological maybe, but you can use it in those ways. And of course, in an arpeggio texture, it's in close proximity with free strokes. So therefore, your hand position should remain very similar. It's a big topic, and it takes some students a very long time to work through it all. So it's a short answer to a very big question. So I've combined another set of questions by Zachary, Linda, and Jonathan, and kind of into one question, just because they were a little bit similar. The question is, when should we use rest strokes? It seems the majority of playing by pros is free stroke. Should we practice them in technique and pieces? Is it best for forte playing? Is there a specific notation for them? So the question of when to use rest strokes is pretty tough and very debatable. You'll get really different answers based on who you talk to, both from pros and teachers and method books. So there's lots of ideas that float around. I'll just mention a couple of small things in regards to that. There are certain results that occur from rest stroke and free stroke. And as long as you know what the result is, then you can choose which technique you wish to use, because it will result in something. So I've already talked about that the sound between your rest strokes and free strokes can end up being pretty similar if you really work on it. But of course, with rest strokes, there's a consequence. If I play the fifth string open and then I play the sixth string, if I do a rest stroke, it mutes the fifth string, right? Because my finger goes down and rests on it, it mutes that. Same thing in an arpeggio. If I do open, open, like free, free, rest, this rest stroke is going to mute the second string out. So that's one result, and that can be very useful. Sometimes you want to mute notes out because you don't want both notes ringing out. So sometimes from an articulation standpoint, it's very, very helpful. It can clean up the playing a little bit. So that's one thing you should know. Rest strokes mute some strings quite often. Free strokes don't. So that is one result of using them. So depending on what musical texture you're playing or what piece you're playing, that will have a factor in deciding which one you use. Now, in terms of the other question about is it best for forte playing, that's a very traditional kind of thought process, is that rest stroke is loud and thumpy, and you can hear it in lots of like flamenco music and lots of chamber music and Spanish music, where it's da, 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 and you like it can be very strong. But the thing is that it doesn't have to be. Your rest strokes can be very soft and very gentle. If you associate your rest strokes with something big and thick and heavy, that's just because that's probably how you're playing your rest strokes. You can play your rest strokes very soft. So very soft or very loud. Same thing with your free strokes. Very soft or very loud. So, it's not that the technique might make it easier to do certain things, but it's you who's controlling the sound with that technique. So do keep that clearly in mind. That said, when I'm playing single line melodic material, especially in chamber music, and I want to play loud, it can kind of just be a safety thing. It's like I can just throw my finger at that string without worrying about hitting the string below. So sometimes, it's just like it's a very security-oriented thing. Other times, for people whose hands shake a lot, sometimes doing a rest stroke keeps your fingers on the strings longer. So it's like a way of having security built into your playing and keeping your hand from shaking, because your one finger is always on the actual guitar. So it kind of secures your right hand. Same thing with thumb rest stroke. Sometimes we'll do a thumb rest stroke and that really secures the whole hand while the fingers do free stroke or whatever else. I talk about that a lot. That's a technique that's used a lot. Doing a rest stroke in the thumb to secure the hand position while your fingers do other things. So it's not just always a musical result. Sometimes it's a technique or self-confidence or security measure that we're using rest strokes for. So there's a lot of different ways to think about these things. But I think the main thing is that there are some actual results that occur from doing rest strokes. So keep those in mind. But then also just make sure that you don't associate rest strokes with being heavied, because that's probably just what your hand has done for a long time. They can be nice and light as well. So should we practice them in technique and pieces? Yes, practice them in your technique especially, so that it's an option that's available to you. And is there a specific notation for them? Some books do have them. Some will have like a little accent hat or a triangle or all sorts of things. I don't think it's been completely codified. Shear has his own symbol, and that's probably the closest to a codification of it. But some people will associate accents even with it on the guitar. But I don't think there's it's not set in stone what the notation will be. So John asks, I am using the Sagreras books 1 and 2 to supplement your material. There are many rest stroke and accent markings, which I've been trying to emphasize with free stroke. I find rest strokes okay when playing scales or note runs, but too difficult when they're part of an arpeggio. It seems to me that as long as the melody is clear, that's what matters. Yeah, so John, I think your question is kind of split though, or you seem a little bit split between the idea of practicing something and performing something. Those accents in his book, I think they are quite beneficial to practice. I wouldn't perform his pieces with those, just personally because of my own personal style. I would perform most of Sagreras' arpeggio pieces with just free stroke. But having practiced his book and Isanola's book as well, his technique book, with lots of rest strokes in arpeggios, it can be very beneficial to teaching a finger to have a deeper stroke within an arpeggio. It also is a very compact technique. When you do a rest stroke, your finger only gets to move a few millimeters, and it can keep your technique really in order and also build upon what I was talking about before in regards to security, keeping a finger on the strings at all times to secure the right hand. So I would highly recommend that you practice his rest strokes and become good at them, but then you can choose whether or not you want to use them in performance. So just really dividing that into two things, practice and performance. Because sometimes when we don't practice something, we aren't good at it, and then we don't like it. Or we associate it. If our rest strokes are automatically really heavy because we're not used to the technique, and that's just how we associate it, then your rest strokes could be light, but if you haven't practiced it, you won't be able to. So just make sure you're separating the idea of practicing something and performing it, and not letting yourself get away with the idea that, oh, I don't like that, so I'm not going to practice it. It's probably beneficial and might be needed at some point. So I highly recommend that you definitely practice them. But to answer your question, no, I don't use many of his rest strokes when I actually play the pieces for enjoyment. Stefan asks, in all my playing, I've never used rest stroke with my thumb. I regularly see you and other teachers advise its use for when it's called for like stopping a bass note, for example. I'm just not comfortable using the rest stroke with the thumb. Would you advise any exercises to develop this? Lots of people find the thumbnail shape tough. Depends if you're using nails or not, but if you're using nails, some people find that their thumbnail catches, so that's something you have to work out from a nail perspective. Your thumb should be able to glide over the string and do a rest stroke with or without nails. And it should be something that's comfortable to you. So I've already talked a little bit about the reasons why we might do a thumb rest stroke, whether it be because we want to do a thumb rest stroke, or we want to mute a string below, or we want security in the right hand to anchor the hand down. Lots of reasons that we might want to. So yes, we want to practice it. Exercises, well, you can practice your scales. Practicing your scales with all thumb rest stroke is a great way to develop the skill. Also remember that sometimes when we're playing arpeggios, because there's 6 strings here, but we generally only use 4 fingers on the classical guitar, we will sometimes do sweeping rest strokes with the thumb. So rest, 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 which is very convenient because each time you start in the correct place for the next string. Rest, rest, rest. So that's a technique that's used a lot, using rest strokes in the thumb like that. And it's the lighter rest stroke. It's like sweeping through the strings. It's not making a big deal of each note or getting caught up on your nail. It really goes through. So that practicing your thumb rest strokes could have if you don't practice them, it could have implications that you won't be able to sweep chords very nicely or something like that. So you definitely want to practice it. And you could just do those 2 exercises for now, like some scales with rest strokes thumb. Or some of my open string exercises from my technique book. I mentioned in a few of the exercises ways of making it a little bit more challenging by adding a rest stroke in the thumb, and again that secures that right hand position. So while these are doing free stroke, I have this anchor here. But you could also just practice doing some sweeps through chords as well. Lots of ways that you can practice it, but the main thing is to just start doing it in certain situations, particularly in your technique sessions, because it's like you can just do it for like 2 minutes in your technique session and it won't frustrate you during a piece or something like that. So get it going in your technique, and then you can start applying it in your repertoire if you think it's necessary. Okay, John asks, I use an I rest stroke without alternation as often as I can, as it is the best sound I can get. The opportunities are usually on slower passages where the entire phrase can be played on a closed first or second string. I also look to use it on the high point of a phrase when it is on the first three strings. Combined with vibrato, this works well for me. What do you think? So like from one perspective, John, I just want to say like, yeah, if it works for you, do it. If you enjoy it, do it. From a teaching perspective, the teacher in me would definitely want to emphasize that you want all the fingers to sound fairly equal. So if your eye finger sounds better than your other fingers, you want to find a way of making these fingers sound better so that you're very versatile and ready for anything that comes up that you might have to do. Because what if at some point it's not possible to repeat the eye finger? You don't want to play with an M finger that doesn't sound good. So make sure you're working on that as part of your technique, of course. On slow passages, it can be like good to repeat a finger sometimes. Like if you just want a super consistent sound or it just feels right in a really slow meditative passage. But like, again, that's like an oddity situation more than the norm. Let me put it this way. There's a difference between practicing and playing. So when you're practicing, you're trying to improve upon things and trying to solve problems. When you're playing, you are after the best musical result. It's a little bit different. So my recommendation to you is that when you're practicing, make sure that you're not practicing in that way, but you are in fact practicing your alternation and you're trying to improve the sound of your other fingers and trying to just become a balanced, equalized kind of player in terms of technique and sound. And then on the other side, on the performance side, if something feels right and it sounds good, that's a choice that you can make on a personal level. But again, a little bit of separation in terms of practicing and playing. So the next two questions aren't directly related to rest stroke and free stroke. They're a little bit more related to fingernails, but I'll try to answer your questions, but also relate it to rest stroke and free stroke in terms of nails a little bit. So Jeff asks, I've been playing without nails and just using my fingertips as I don't like long fingernails in general. Do you have any tips, sorry, no pun intended, for playing without nails or perhaps just short nails? I've been basically using standard technique, but varying my angle of attack to achieve a nice sound, but still not really happy with the results. So Jeff, from one perspective, playing without nails is fine. There's lots of people that play without nails and you can sound really good. I've had some great students that play sports and they don't play with nails and they still sound really great. Nails add a little bit of volume and clarity and also a little bit of confidence to your technique in terms of control over the sound, but they're not 100% necessary. Lots of great pros play without nails as well, lute players and early music specialists as well. One thing I would say if you're not happy with the results is that if you don't try to compare yourself to people that play with nails, you'll want to find players that play without nails and then listen to the sound that they get and how they work around problems and how they can sound really good without nails. And then that should be your model. So you want to practice with that model in mind rather than comparing yourself to people with nails, because it can be difficult to keep up with the clarity of nails and things like that. I wouldn't vary the angle of attack too much in your technique. You want to practice pretty much the same style of technique. Solid hand position, rest stroke and free stroke should be similar. Nails help a little bit in free stroke. Rest stroke without nails is generally fine. You're going through the string, you're pushing it in towards your stomach. Free stroke though, because nails are in ramps, they really push the nature of the ramped fingernail pushes the string into the guitar for you. So it really does help with free stroke. But when you play without nails, you're just going to start on the edge of your finger and your finger is curved a little bit. So it's the same technique. You might just be a little bit more under the string. You don't want to yank the string out, but it's a very similar stroke in the end. You're moving your finger in towards the palm like that, but there's no nail. So in terms of rest stroke and free stroke, not a huge difference, but you might find there's a little bit more of a plucky nature to playing without the nails there. What I'll say about long fingernails is that rest stroke can be challenging for students, and sometimes your nails might be too long. If you play with free stroke almost all the time with long nails, and then you go to rest stroke, you might find that your rest strokes are pretty harsh, or they catch, or it's not easy to glide through the string, especially like on the thumb. So you definitely want to find a balance. And again, that's why I'd recommend in your technique sessions, you practice with both rest stroke and free stroke, so that you're also figuring out what your nail shape will be, maybe not right now, but in a year from now. Because you might be using rest strokes more in a year from now, so you don't want to have to change your nails too. So finding a good nail shape that works with both is really essential. In terms of my advice as a teacher, is that in your long-term development, you want to work those things out now so it doesn't become a problem later on if you advance to the level where you feel like you really need to use more rest stroke. Zachary asks, my teacher started playing without nails as a way to approach rest stroke sound with free stroke agility. I personally prefer the sound as well. I wonder to what extent the preference in the community for nails is inertia at this point, especially considering that so much playing, even at the professional level, is recorded or online, so the extra volume afforded by nails isn't necessary as it once was. Well, I mean, it's, in the pandemic times, people are online a lot, but we're all hoping that we'll go back to concert halls as well, and that the volume and clarity of nails will be important. I kind of already answered this. There's lots of great players that play without nails. It's kind of a personal preference, and something that you can work with. I don't think it's an inertia at this point. Like, most professional classical guitarists use nails for volume, clarity, control, and that's both control over the sound. You can get a very consistent sound with a consistent nail shape. And with your fingers you can too, but it can be, sometimes the fingers will sound different depending on how long your fingers are, or other issues like that. But also control and technique. When you have long fingernails in a ramped fashion, they will stop on the string at a certain point, and then you need to exert a little bit of stroke in order to make the string travel up the fingernail ramp and get pushed into the guitar. So it's kind of like a stop motion. You put your finger on the string, but it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't slip off because there's a ramped nail that the string will have to go over. And so, like, when I do a rest stroke, my thumb stops there because it's resting on the nail. And that can be done with fingers as well. I'm not saying it's just for fingernails. However, lots of people will prefer that control. But it's kind of like, it's not really something that I can answer. Most professional pros at the professional level, in like the purest classical guitar circle, whatever that is, but they do use nails, and so and they do it for a variety of reasons. But yeah, when it comes down to it, it's really like, it's up to you. If you enjoy the sound without nails and you're mainly playing at home, great. Go for it. And in terms of rest stroke and free stroke, students, it does take a long time to work out your nail shape. Make sure they're short enough, but also long enough that you get the control you need, but also polished in a way and angled at a way that really does produce a beautiful sound. And so some students don't make it. Some actually do just personally prefer to play without nails, and that's fine. Other students, like, it's such a long process. Like, I don't think I was happy with my nails for like 5 years, but I kind of persevered. It got better and better every year, so I wasn't discouraged, but nevertheless, it took a long time for me to get a nail shape that I was really happy with and to just work it all out. And as with any technique when you're a student, it takes a long time to work out, and if you stick with it, you probably will work it out. And if you get good advice from teachers, you can find things that work in the end. So it really comes down to where you're at in your own personal kind of journey with the guitar, and how much you're practicing, and what kind of sound you're after. So thanks everyone for submitting questions. I hope that was a little bit helpful. Also check out some of the other articles on the site about right hand position and rest stroke and free stroke, and the nail article, all those other helpful things.